Are you looking for an antidote to information overload? Well, at a time when the news cycle is moving faster than ever, The Week is here to help. Our new digital subscription includes a twice-daily digest of the day's most interesting, important stories, along with the liveliest comment and analysis delivered to your app or inbox. Head to theweek.com/offer and use the code SPRING24. That's SPRING24 at theweek.com/offer. Sale ends 6th of May. It's the week ending Saturday the 13th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Biden promising ironclad support for Israel if Iran retaliates against them, the publication of the long-awaited CAS review into gender identity services for children and young people, and Mattel launching a new version of Scrabble, which is less competitive. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and the boss man, Holden Frith. And from the Week magazine, it's assistant editor, Leif Arbuthnot. And Harriet, you're kicking us off this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Did a British man become the world's hardest geezer?
YouTuber Bambino Becky filming the crowds getting excited in Tunisia. Harriet, why? And who is Geezer?
The so-called hardest geezer is what this man Russ Cook has been calling himself. So what you heard there is Russ Cook, this guy from Sussex, crossing the finish line on this really epic run from the bottommost point of Africa all the way up to the top in Tunisia. So he started running last April and he finished on Sunday. It took him 352 days and he ran the equivalent of about more than 360 marathons. So on average, more than a marathon a day.
Wow. Well, we'll get to the feet in a moment, but there's also, and this is part of your story of the week, isn't it, been a bit of controversy ever since, because he claimed he was the first person to run the length of Africa.
Yeah, he claims to have been the first, but that claim has already been disputed by the World Runners Association, which sounds like it would be a big organization, but is actually only 7 ultra athletes who say that, in fact, a Danish man did it back in 2010. And also that Danish man himself has said, well, I wasn't even the first. Apparently, he is saying that there was a British man to do it in 1998, which can't really be verified. So Russ Cook has explicitly claimed to have been the first person to do so. But when he was on Good Morning Britain yesterday, they had the strapline on the bottom saying the first Brit to do so, which is it's very much in dispute, but I think what's not in dispute is just how incredible this feat actually is.
Yeah, my understanding, Holden, is regardless of whether he was the first or not, Guinness are now going to be looking into evidence that he was the fastest, and he'd still be able to claim the record for the fastest person ever to run Africa.
That seems to be undisputed. And in fact, this does seem to be a refreshingly civilised dispute. Both parties have spoken of the others with respect and kind of heaped praise on their feats of endurance, and it does seem like they've accomplished slightly different things in that Jesper Ken Olsen, the Danish runner, started in Taba on Egypt's Red Sea coast, not the Mediterranean at the top, and he ran to the Cape of Good Hope, which is a sort of diagonal line southwest, and I think colloquially you'd definitely say he'd run the length of Africa, but he didn't go from the northernmost point to the southernmost point. He did a sort of diagonal line across it.
I wonder if that geniality, Leaf, with them all saying, oh, we all applaud each other's efforts, but we just wanted to straighten the record, is slightly forced because of the world of social media trolling that we're now in, that they just don't want to be taken apart by the Geezers fans by pointing out that they did it first.
Yeah, and they already are being taken apart by the Geezers fans. I think the athletes who put the record straight or claim to have put it straight have been abused on social media with people saying that they're, trying to steal the Geezers' thunder. But also, I was on Russell Cook's Instagram, and he still says on his bio, it says the first person ever to run the full length of Africa with a little, Africa emoji. So he's still kind of milking this label. And I think it's very impressive. I don't really care whether he was the first person or the second person or the third person. But I think people who are in the running community, especially this kind of very niche, sort of serious, extreme running community, take these things very seriously. And so they probably do mind a lot about, the kind of the small print detail. It's also worth saying that when he ran this enormous distance, he was kind of running along the left flank of Africa, which is to say the bulgy bit, and through some seriously, challenging countries. When we think of the length of Africa, we might think of someone going bang down the middle, but actually he was going the sort of hard route along the left. So I do think it's extremely impressive, and it's a bit of a shame, really, that there's been this row about whether he was the first.
Well, I think you've put your finger on something interesting in terms of the social audience maybe being different to the general audience that are reading about it in the papers and finding these articles where the ultra runners have pointed out the potential inaccuracy of his statements. Because, Harriet, this is really a social media story in a sense, isn't it? You've brought it to us as your story of the week because it's something that's been boiling away on Instagram and on YouTube with his fans following his progress for a year. But most of us have only heard about it this week.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that he did a few interviews at the start because obviously he was already quite well known in these circles anyway, having claimed to have been the first Brit to run from Asia to the UK when he ran from Istanbul to London back in 2019. But it's absolutely, he's been just incredibly huge on social media, not least because he's got this wonderful support team and these amazing videos that have been going on YouTube and Instagram, as you say, but also he's been directly communicating with his hundreds of thousands of people around the world. He's been actively kind of saying, this is how I feel, this is what I've experienced. He's documented being kidnapped in the Congo, getting food poisoning in Namibia. He was robbed at gunpoint in Angola, threatened with machetes. He had to run the length of the Sahara at night to avoid the heat. So this incredible epic journey has been kind of documented in real time on all these different social media channels in actually an incredibly interesting and very sort of relatable way, despite how unrelatable this experience is.
And actually, from that point of view, I suppose this is what I'm getting at as I'm labouring the point. That audience don't really care, do they, about the sport of ultra-marathon running or long-distance running. They care about him and his version of the truth as he's presenting it. That's the thing they've bought into.
I think it's fair to say they care about both. I think also the social media aspect really came into play when he got stuck in Mauritania trying to get into Algeria because his team weren't able to get visas into Algeria because of the very contentious relationship between the two countries and the danger of jihadist activity in the region. And he pleaded on social media for help. And this was shared like 11 million times. And a member of the British government caught this and wrote an open letter to the Algerian ambassador. And eventually he was granted kind of a temporary visa. But that was directly because of this interest. It's on social media. That's not just people that care about him, also people that care about all the things he's witnessing and the people that care about the implications for what he's doing.
There's also something very British about him, isn't there, Holden? He's an eccentric, basically, isn't he? The geezer nickname, the long ginger beard that he's got now as a result of presumably not shaving for a year. Because people make comparisons with Forrest Gump when they're interviewing him. Oh, this is like Forrest Gump running across America. I feel like if an American was doing it would have a different tone. There's a real have-a-go hero element to his whole shtick.
Yeah, I think that the amateurishness appearance of it, even though, he's clearly very well practiced, very well trained. This took a huge amount of effort. The kind of logistics involved in it are immense. But yes, there is that sense of him, almost looking like he jumped out of a pub and started running and never stopped. And there is, there is an element of Forrest Gump about that, but it's a very British lens that it's sort of been refracted.
Well, it was a nightclub actually. That's actually exactly what happened. I think that's what people love about it as well, is that how he started running. He ran home from a nightclub and his friends, because of that, he was drunk and he was running home from a nightclub, and his friends bullied him into doing a half marathon because of it. And that's how he said he got the bug. So it's literally the most British story.
It's not good for you though, is it? Running, the equivalent of a marathon every day.
I don't think
No,
so.
obviously not.
I think people, I mean, hopefully his knees will be okay for the next few years. But I've noticed that people who are really big runners, you know, when they're in their 50s and so on, they end up having serious problems and having to stop running altogether.
That's the Schadenfreude podcast series I need. Just listening to ultra-marathon runners in their 50s.
I know. The thing is, they probably do gain, like, years of life by being fit. So it's hard to know. Probably in balance, you know, people who do ultramarathons will end up outliving most kind of lazy slobs, you know. But, I mean, on specific pressure points, such as your hips and your knees, it's not going to be good for you. Particularly over, you know, what is, it looks like often just like roads. It's quite hard surfaces that he's running on.
Yeah, some bits he had to go through the jungle.
I read an account of somebody who'd taken part in a coast-to-coast race in the US. So, you know, also many marathons day after day. And he was saying that on something like day 25, you start to feel every single injury your body has ever had reasserting itself, re-emerging. And it just kind of wears at the structure of your bones and muscles and tendons, and it wasn't a great advert for the sport, I have to say.
That said, though, Harriet, I think one of the inspirational things that people are drawn to is that it is theoretically something that anyone, or at least anyone of that kind of age, can do. That all you need is some trainers and then you can go for a run. Whereas in reality, as we've discussed, there's a huge logistical operation. He's making a YouTube video every day with drones and all the rest of it. But I mean, in reality, you could just set off and run. And I think there's something primal about that, isn't there? Something connecting people and nature and doing something of their own momentum, which is appealing.
Yes, but I would dispute the fact that anyone can do that. I mean, I think that actually what really, really, really fascinates people is that most people could never or would never consider doing this, that it seems to be such an alien. The psychology of this kind of thing is so fascinating. You know, you read more about these types of ultra marathons, these races, you know, across 6-day trips across the Sahara or coast to coast runs, or these guys that run this many marathons per year, or this woman who's just recently become the first woman to complete the hardest race in the world. What's so fascinating about it is that it does seem to be a very unique psychology. This isn't like a typical person. A typical person might put on their trainers and go for a run, maybe do a 5K, maybe run a half marathon. But what's so interesting about these people is that it's so incomprehensible and such an extraordinary feat, mentally, physically, emotionally. I mean, just being away that long from your loved ones, but pushing yourself to the very limits of human endurance. I think that is in fact what really fascinates people, is the fact that most people could never do it and wouldn't want to.
And yet, Holden, there is a growing popularity for ultra running.
Yes, it's hard to find precise figures, but it seems that it had been growing at a relatively slow rate from 1996 to about 2008, when it reached 100,000 people who were competing in kind of certified events. But then after that, it starts to grow at a much faster rate, reaching about 700,000 entrants a decade later. And it seems that COVID since then has actually fueled further increase, partly I think because running was one of the few things you could do in the way of exercise over those years, but also people had more time on their hands. But I wondered also if there was something connected to the rise of Fitbit and Strava and those sorts of activity tracking devices, and that made long distance running more popular in general because, well, partly they're an important part of the training process. But also I think there's probably a psychological effect, because if you're out running for hours every day on your own, it must be quite satisfying to be able to look back and on the data and sort of actually have a record of it, and more of a sense that it really happened if you can look at it. It's not just something that kind of disappeared into the ether.
Leaf, are you going to make like Rishi Sunak and stick on a pair of Adidas?
No way. I really don't like running at all. But my sister is a really good runner, and she did the Marathon des Sables, which is 6 marathons over 6 days in the desert in the Sahara. And that was extraordinary to watch. And I was a bit sort of, not particularly excited when she announced it, because I thought it's damaging for her body. But actually watching her do it, you can track her on a sort of GPS going, was really inspiring.
Oh, when you say watching us, you weren't standing in the desert.
No,
I
wasn't.
Sitting in a deck chair
I was actually
martini.
at work, with my computer on. And she came back without any toenails, as everyone does on this marathon, and they have to carry all of their equipment. And I was so impressed. And basically, I mean, at the heart of it, I think, was a kind of curiosity about whether she could do it and what it would be like. And I think that's one of the things that really separates these runners from normal people, which is that they have this curiosity. I know that I would find it really painful and that I would hate to see my toenails drop off. But these people are built differently, as Harriet says.
Did her toenails grow back?
Yes.
We should mention, Harriet, shouldn't we, that the geezer, Russell Cook, has made a lot of money for charity in this enterprise.
No, he has. I think that's a really important point. He said in his own words, it's about creating an impact that goes beyond a geezer running across a continent. He's raised, I think at the time that we're recording, it's about £880,000 for 2 charities. And one of them raises awareness about people and culture of the Sahara through arts in the UK, and one that helps people experiencing homelessness. So there is a fortune to be raised, and a lot of people running marathons and ultra marathons raise an extraordinary amount of money and awareness of the causes that they're interested in. So it's more than just what they do for themselves, it's what they can do for other people as well.
Indeed. Okay, Leif, you're up next after this. Are you looking for an antidote to information overload? Well, at a time when the news cycle is moving faster than ever, The Week is here to help. Our new digital subscription includes a twice-daily digest of the day's most interesting, important stories, along with the liveliest comment and analysis delivered to your app or inbox. Head to theweek.com/offer and use the code SPRING24. That's SPRING24 at theweek.com/offer. Sale ends 6th of May. Okay, Leif, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it farewell to Ted Baker?
Guys, listen, I'm out here in St. Paul's and I'm literally just outside the old Ted Baker store, which has been stripped out. Why? Because they have just gone into administration. Now, this was a big store right here in the middle of central London, not too far from Bank. And I thought I'd go down there and do a little store tour, but I was surprised to see that it's already been stripped out and closed down.
Is Ted Baker finished? A video posted to the Hoxton Trend YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago. So Leif, Ted Baker, high street store, fashion store, has been in trouble, at least for, as we're revealing, a fortnight now, but it's been getting worse this week.
Yes, so this is a very recognisable high street store, and it's apparently going to shut 15 UK stores and cut 245 jobs, according to administrators. So some of these shops are in Birmingham, Bristol, Cambridge, that are going to close by the 19th of April. And then there are 4 other shops that are going to close in the coming weeks. So the one in Bicester, a couple more in London, and one in Manchester.
And what's at the root of their problems?
Well, it's a long story that goes back to 2019, when the founder of Ted Baker, who had set it up just
we should say is called Ray Kelvin and not Ted Baker.
No,
Ted Baker is a fictional character.
He is a fictional character. So he rather gloriously, this guy, named the company after an alter ego, his own alter ego, who was an intrepid aviator, a sportsman, and a sort of the consort of princesses and Hollywood beauties, so he says. And in 2019, he was accused of basically harassing women in the workplace, for instance, asking them to sit on his lap, and I think something to do with kissing their ears. Some
forced hugs.
Forced hugs is a big one. Yeah, some slightly odd behaviour from him. So he was chucked, and then new people came in. But basically...
Sure, he'd say he stood down.
The brand has been facing lots of problems, including mounting debt, but also an issue with the actual clothes themselves. This is the thing that I'm most interested in. A lot of competition on the high street these days, as we know, but Ted Baker, in my view, hasn't been refreshing its offer and basically trying to appeal to, trying to keep up with the times. And it looks like this failure to keep up with the times, both in terms of its marketing strategy and also in terms of the actual fashion that it's offering, has landed it in hot water, and all these jobs are at risk as a result.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it, Holden? Because if you just visualise a Ted Baker store, without even actually walking into one, if you just think of one in your brain, it is that kind of pink and black and gold 90s aesthetic, really, which for menswear is about kind of bright and floral shirts and funky socks. And for women's wear, it's kind of basically it's office wear, isn't it? Or something you'd wear to a cocktail party. And it hasn't changed a lot, but our lifestyles have.
Yes, I read a few pieces suggesting that the leadership problems and the changes that happened to Ted Baker in 2019 came at a really bad time, because that was clearly just before the pandemic. And so for the next 2 years, we basically spent all of our time at home. So we weren't going to any of the kind of occasions where Ted Baker attire may have been necessary or desirable. Then going into the cost of living crisis after that kind of premium retail, the optional purchases would probably be lower down the list. And I think there was also the sense I read in a piece in Retail Gazette, which said that Ray Kelvin, he'd been the founder, he'd run the company for 30 years. His personal DNA was very much a part of the brand, and that he had a kind of creative connection to it, which is harder to come by when you're then looking for outside management and actually quite a kind of complicated corporate structure, which is what Ted Baker ended up with.
Yeah, I mean, making no comment about whether or not he should still be at the company, Leaf, it does feel like an example of Ray Kelvin leaving and then the company struggling without its founder, that the founder really is a creative leader there.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it that way, but I'm a little bit sceptical about that, partly because the 2010s saw this massive expansion of Ted Baker under his watch. It kind of expanded abroad, and it started doing fragrances and all sorts of other stuff. And that doesn't seem to have left it in a particularly good position now. So I don't think that Ray Kelvin necessarily has a right to sort of be like, I left it, and now look at where they've ended up. I think one of the other issues with Ted Baker, and this is quite maybe a niche one, is that its brand is so uncool, and yet it often has its brand name on all of its stuff. For instance, if you buy a bag, it says Ted Baker printed on it, and if that's kind of part of the design of the clothes that you do, you have to be sure that people are proud to own Ted Baker and display Ted Baker, the actual logo. And I wouldn't be, and nor would any of my friends, and nor would my parents. It's just not cool anymore. I do think it's slightly wrong to suggest that it's just Ray Kelvin's departure and everything went wrong. I think it's been in trouble for a long time, and it overexpanded in the 2010s, and there are other things at play, as Holden has touched upon.
There's also a wider culture, perhaps, Harriet, of brands like that, the idea of wearing a name on your clothes, just losing power because people buy things differently these days, predominantly through social media. That's the big change.
I think there is a tendency to assign these narratives about social media and moving away from brands and the power of big brands among younger consumers. I think that narrative is a little bit misplaced. I think that might be true of a very small subsection of the market. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a question of brands losing power, but as Leaf said, it's a brand that is associated with uncool. It's an incredibly recognizable brand. I think I'm a good test case for this. I'm an average person with very little knowledge of fashion, and I could tell you, okay, I'm thinking of Ted Baker, I think of the florals, the fitted, the wrap coat, the internal linings with the butterflies and stuff. Like, I know exactly what it looks like, even if it doesn't say Ted Baker on it. And that's a problem, because that means that the stuff looks old-fashioned. It looks samey and it's dowdy and all the things that you can't be for a young buyer. And the fashion at the moment being very loose-fitting, very androgynous, very sporty. Why would you want tightly fitting florals? And then also, I guess we could also talk about the major rise in secondhand shopping and how it's between fast fashion and secondhand shopping. Ted Baker's at the wrong price point. It's at the wrong price point, because it's not cheap enough in a cost of living crisis for someone like me to now use it to buy a cocktail dress or a wedding guest outfit or whatever that it was known for. I'm not dropping 200 odd quid on a dress that I'm going to wear at formal occasions. I'm going to go somewhere like Next that's at the £60 price point, or Zara at the £50, or somebody might go H&M or Primark at a much lower price point. And then the people who, after the cost of living crisis, are still infinitely richer, it's not expensive enough or luxury enough for them, but it's also not disruptive enough or cool enough to transcend either of those things. So it's at the wrong price point. It's at the wrong, what it's trying to do with itself is wrong now, and it's not appealing, as far as I can see, based on very little knowledge of this sector. It's not appealing to anyone in particular.
Worth saying, though, Holden, that Ted Baker is still quite a big international operation, isn't it? A lot of it, I understand, through licenses, so this latest administration doesn't necessarily affect that. But It seems to me there are still going to be buyers in the Middle East, for example, or in the United States, who like the Britishness of Ted Baker. And we're talking about it not meeting an audience. There is an audience for it.
Yes, this question goes to the complicated corporate structure I alluded to earlier on. So the part of the company that's actually in trouble is the UK-based subsidiary called No Ordinary Designer Label, which runs retail in the UK and the rest of Europe. The parent company, which is now an American group called Authentic Brands Group, they're still doing fine. So the Ted Baker brand itself isn't going to disappear. They are doing very well, as you suggest, in the Middle East, and yeah, it's possible that what it stands for has not gone out of fashion so much in other places as it has in its sort of home territory. But there are attempts to find a retail home for it in the UK too. And it's interesting that Harriet mentioned Next, because that actually is one of the companies that has been mentioned as a potential buyer. So they might look to have Ted Baker as a kind of sub-brand within Next. And another factor actually in Ted Baker's trouble here has been the collapse of Debenhams, because Ted Baker was a kind of key home for the Ted Baker concession, and that has obviously left the high street.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it, Leif? I mean, Harriet was talking about narratives around fashion that you can disprove. One of the narratives is people don't want to go to old-fashioned department stores anymore. And yet, Marks and Spencer is booming now Debenhams has gone, and actually Next is basically becoming Debenhams with a whole load of concessions for different brands that they own.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist who's been working since, 2015, I've learnt to be pretty sceptical about the idea that Marks and Spencer's waxes and wanes, and it might be doing fairly well right now, but I don't know, in my experience doesn't last forever and ever. But it's true that basically young shoppers don't really see the point of department stores increasingly. They wouldn't really think to go to them. And so if your brand is really dependent on, sales in department stores, then your buyers are going to be, getting older and older and older. And that's not a good idea, particularly if you're one of your key offers, as Ted Baker's is the sort of wedding guest / office worker look. I think it's worth reiterating, if we haven't, said it enough already, that we do associate Ted Baker with kind of, say, like suit, like some maybe like magenta suit trousers and like flowery tops that women might wear to the office. But a lot of professional women are going into the office maybe a couple of days a week less than they used to. And so that's probably also affecting Ted Baker's potential here. And
just very cynically, is now a good time to grab a bargain then? I mean, if their shops are literally about to close?
Well, so I was actually wondering this. So I went and had a look on the website, which, by the way, is basically unusable on a mobile phone. So I'm sure that's to do with their problems as well. Their online presence is terrible. There is absolutely there's no budgets to be had on it whatsoever. And then let's say I wanted the very iconic wrap coat, it's still at the $250 price point on the website. I can get it on Vinted for £50. I found one that was new, unworn, for £50. I think also it's worth talking about probably the most famous bit of bad PR that Ted Baker's had in the last few years. I was talking about with my colleague this morning, when the character Shiv Roy on Succession very famously wore a Ted Baker dress to her mother's wedding, and it generated a massive amount of discussion on social media, not least because the dress was considered to be extraordinarily unflattering and frumpy and old-fashioned, but also because people were questioning, why would a billionaire be shopping in Ted Baker? Why would the dress was valued, I think, 160 odd pounds. So why would a billionaire be shopping in Ted Baker? Is it a conscious choice by the costume director to make Shiv seem like she's trying to be like of the people? Because basically the summary was, it's the wrong price point for everyone.
Although Kate Middleton did wear the blue trench, didn't she, famously?
Yeah, but Kate Middleton's always trying to look like she's a woman of the people. That's part of her role, that she has to sort of mix really luxury fashion with kind of more affordable pieces, So it doesn't surprise me, in fact, that Kate Middleton has worn Ted Baker. In fact, I would go so far as to say that her look is quite Ted Baker, in my view.
There we go. Damning. Okay, Holden, you're up next after this. Holden, it's over to you. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why America's gearing up for another meaty debate.
You take cells which are living, and as long as they're fed kept warm, and given a place to grow without competition from bacteria, they'll continue to grow using their genetic programming.
The only animal product in there is chicken cells.
Watch out, Chick-fil-A. It's really good. It tastes exactly like you expect it to, and in your mouth it chews apart the way you expected me to. It tastes really good.
Taste test lab-grown meat, a video posted to YouTube by Freethink last Friday. So Holden, lab-grown meat isn't new, is it? Although it's not widely on sale yet, but it's being much talked about in the United States this week. Why?
Yes, it's being talked about in a lot of places, including the Iowa State Legislature, which on Wednesday passed a law called the Meat Integrity Act. This requires any product containing meat substitutes to be labelled as meatless or imitation. This is actually a relatively mild example of a broader trend in which several American states are trying to discourage or even outlaw lab-grown meat alternatives. The most prominent of these is Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to sign a law banning the production or sale of lab-grown meats in the state.
Okay, and just to be clear, because some people do get these confused, don't they? We're not talking about sort of Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger, fake meat vegan products. We're talking about actually cultivating cells in a lab and creating an exact replica of animal product.
Yeah, that's right. The ones that are widely available now are made of plant-based ingredients like soya or pea protein, and they're then sort of flavoured or textured to get as close as possible to meat. But these ones we're talking about, they go by various different names actually, so sort of lab-grown, cultured, cultivated, cell-based. And as you say, they start off with cells from animals, and then in very controlled conditions, they're encouraged to grow and multiply, and they turn into something which is indistinguishable from meat, although it's never been part of an animal that's alive, with the exception of those few starter cells.
Okay, so just on the issue, Harriet, of what they are governing on in Iowa here, does it matter to consumers, do you think, when these products eventually hit the shelves, that they're not called meat on the packet, or that if it is called meat, it needs to be called meatless meat? I mean, aren't consumers savvy enough to understand it's not meat?
I think it's not a question of whether or not consumers are savvy. I think this is much more to do with politics than it's actually to do with consumers and to do with, you know, the farming lobby. It's kind of a broader upheaval in American politics. So previously, the left and the center left in America was kind of very anti-establishment, very natural products, very distrusting, whereas the center right was much more about the establishment and regulation and kind of trusting the experts. That has completely flipped on its head over the past 10 years or so. I mean, it's, you know, the right of center has become kind of seized on this traditional idea of America being very iconoclastic, very libertarian, this wild, rugged freedom. And that has coincided with an electorate, a Trump and Republican voting electorate that is much more rural, much more working class, and more distrustful of big businesses and the experts. So it's not a coincidence that Iowa and Florida are very, very, very red states. And it's not a coincidence that Iowa also was the vanguard in pushing this legislation that has tried to legalize the sale of raw unpasteurized milk in quite a few states now as well. That's also become a massive culture war. So it's this incredible confluence of like political upheaval and culture war, what distrust of the experts, what control and who's telling them to do what, and then also kind of a bigger health story as well, and a bigger kind of interest in chemicals and experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans don't usually like the government banning things, Leaf, so it is interesting, isn't it, to see this pivot. We want to stop American enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty skeptical that Republicans don't like banning things. I think that they don't like banning things that they like. They like banning, you know, they like the idea of banning books, for instance, that don't align with their own political agendas. I think we need to fully say goodbye to the idea that today's kind of Trumpian Republican Party is anti, quite muscular moves against businesses that it doesn't like. It's Ron DeSantis, the one who's had a kind of ongoing battle with Disney, And I think that this is yet another example of business being used as a sort of political tool. But, a lot of people are actually quite grossed out by the idea of lab-grown meat. And although in that video we saw a person kind of enjoying the meat, I noticed that the meat that this person was enjoying was kind of like... it wasn't exactly high test case meat. For instance, it was chicken in what looked like a dumpling, and maybe chicken in potentially like a sort of nugget thing that was put in a burger. And in those cases, the chicken is being sort of performed by stuff like ketchup and maybe, the casing around the dumpling. So there's perhaps a degree that to which lab-grown meat can kind of be masked by other ingredients if it's kind of packed in the right way. But I think that right now it's still really early technology, and probably the meat isn't that good yet.
There's also, at the moment, as I understand, Holden, no proof that lab-grown meat is better for the environment, which is the main reason that you might want to buy it, apart from if you believe that all farming is cruel to animals and there's no organic or free-range version that is kinder to animals, and therefore you'd only eat it if it was lab-grown. Because at the moment it's more intensive, isn't it, for the environment than actually rearing an animal?
Because we're still really at the prototype phase here, it is a huge amount of effort is going into producing a very small amount. So yes, there is a sort of energy intensive and just human effort intensive quality to it, and that makes it incredibly expensive too. There's been some research done into the effect that this would have on the environment if it became commercially viable, and if you were able to replace large amounts of beef, chicken, pork at the kind of cost level, which would mean you were also being able to produce it at a less intensive resource level too. And at that point, it would be much, much better for the environment. There are various figures, but there's sort of no question that it would be a significant reduction. Some of the figures I saw were you'd need about half the amount of energy overall, 80 to 95% less water, 80 to 95% less greenhouse gas emissions, and just 2% of the land use requirement. So, I think that there's a good chance that this is a dead end that goes nowhere. There's a good chance that it remains a niche product, but if it did take off, it would be an absolute revolution. And I think that's probably stoking some of the fears, because it's a revolution not just in terms of what we'd be eating, but in the lifestyle of a lot of these American states in particular. Harriet said that Florida and Iowa are red states. They're also very agricultural states. And if you look through the list of some of the others that have been considering these bans, it's Tennessee, Arizona, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota. It's hard to picture those states without thinking of agriculture. And I think that goes to the heart of why this sort of what seems like a relatively minor threat at the moment is generating a lot of political energy.
And that's where you get to your point about the meat lobby, Harriet. I mean, it might not seem like something they should be frightened of right now, but they're projecting into the future. And if you are a farmer in one of those states, this isn't something you can pivot into even if you wanted to, is it? It's a highly processed scientific thing. You can't just suddenly start growing your own meat. Yeah,
absolutely. It's exactly like Holden says. Some of these states, like Tennessee in particular, it's just vast areas of agricultural farming. It's like half the state is farmland for agriculture. And we're seeing a similar issue in the EU, whereby all the very powerful farming lobbies and agricultural farmers doing very carbon intensive animal farming are really creating a situation where the EU is having to water down quite a lot of its green policies to appease them, because the protectionism, they're saying, their way of life is threatened, but their way of life is already threatened by inflation, by rising interest rates, by a decrease in subsidies from elsewhere, like the UK now, farmers don't get EU subsidies. So I think it's important to say that this is a much bigger picture than the US, and also it's a much bigger picture than just cultured or lab-grown meat. They're also talking about potentially the future, like what is our future with carbon-intensive animal farming. The emissions from animal farming, they do more damage in the EU than all the cars and all the vans combined. It's an incredibly devastating for the environment. So if there is a chance that lab-grown or cultured meat could take off, and if, as Holden says, if in the future it could attract enough investment or enough technological advancement that it could replace agricultural farming, yes, that would be devastating to the way of life of thousands of communities around the world and farmers, big businesses, agricultural businesses. But it could also provide kind of a bigger solution to the climate crisis and potentially the future of humanity.
If people trust it enough to eat it, Leaf, I mean, that's the thing you were alluding to as well, wasn't it, when you were saying people were grossed out by it? I mean, I kind of theoretically don't mind the idea of lab-grown meat if it's been proven to be safe and there's been clinical trials and all that sort of thing. But I was reading Beneath the Line, which you should never do, and one of the commenters on the Mail Online said, ask a vegetarian if they prefer lab-grown vegetables. And I thought that's kind of it, isn't it? It's actually like, if you take the politics out of it and the meat out of it, I don't like the idea of eating anything that's been grown in a lab if I can eat a natural alternative.
Yeah, I think I would be really up for eating lab-grown meat if it was if it was completely indistinguishable from normal meat. I don't actually have a kind of ethical objection to it, although, you know, my heart would presumably go out to all the farmers who've been put out of a job. But I think the scientific challenge is immense. If you think of a steak, you know, the marbling in it and the sort of run of fat down the side, I don't think I'd want to like get out a pat of completely, you know, uniform fake steak and fry and eat it. I don't think that would like make me hungry. So I think that right now, you know, in theory, these states are kind of preparing for this kind of Armageddon of fake meat, but the science really has far to go. And I suppose, you know, we'll have to see what happens, because I agree with Harriet that the potential gains are really significant, and that it could be it could be great for people who can't really afford meat as well. If the cost of fake meat that's indistinguishable from normal meat comes right down, it could be really good for, you know, people in poor countries as well as, you know, middle income and upper income countries.
And say some people, Holden, good for Bill Gates to take over our brains and bodies again. Just explain that theory to us.
Yes, that is a bizarre but possibly predictable element to all of this. I think there's partly a kind of general sense that fits in with the sort of anti-government prepping conspiracies that if all our food is grown in a lab, then the government could shut it off or determine who gets it in a way that wouldn't be possible with traditional agriculture. But then, as you say, this is something that Bill Gates has funded because of the environmental benefits it may hold, but because he also funded some of the COVID vaccines, and, you know, he sort of generally seemed to be somewhat connected to 5G. There's the people who see those as phase one of a plan to take over the world are suggesting that lab-grown meat is phase two of that project.
I mean, it seems ridiculous from the point of view of inserting microchips into every human and animal on the world, yes. But from the point of view of, if you actually manage to kill so much of farming with your proprietorial technology that people are reliant on a corporation to create meat, and farmers lose the ability to be able to do it anymore, you can see how that conspiracy has some legs.
I think there are people who love conspiracy theories and latch them onto whatever thing they feel vaguely uneasy about. But as I was reading about this, to be honest, I increasingly did understand the people who have more of a kind of romantic or emotional attachment to farming, and, you know, that whether that's on the left or the right, and it kind of manifests itself in different ways in different countries. But I think it's almost a bit like coal mining, and by the time of the 1980s there weren't that many people in the UK employed in coal mining. Looking back on it objectively, it's not a job you would wish your children to be going into, and yet still it has that kind of political potency, and people connect it with a sense of community and with a connection to the land. And, you know, you can see that generating energy for a country, generating food for a country, those are things that kind of strike deeply, and so people have strong feelings about them.
Or is it just a cynical ploy for votes? I'm just going to leave this open to any one of you who wants to react to this quote that I found in The Guardian, which I love. Sparsha Saha, a lecturer on meat politics at Harvard, says, quote, "Meat is inherently political. We know that meat attachment is higher on the right. We know that masculinity norms tend to be stronger among conservative men, and meat is associated with masculinity. if you're a politician and you want to make sure that conservative men are getting mobilised to come out and vote, this is a really good political strategy.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, there is a reason that famously so many of the very far right trolley incel type influencers go so hard on the fact that they only eat meat or they would never be a vegetarian. A soy boy is a very typical insult leveled. That is a very widely used insult on the right wing to level against kind of effeminate vegetarian soy eating men. Is massively associated with masculinity and with virility, and like Holden said, with this halcyon idea of times, of bucolic times gone past, a simpler time that is, like with the coal mining, was never really true. Everything has been politicized in this world, but it's also about a narrative, and it's about this idea of meat that is so far removed from the experience of the typical farmer and the experience of the razor thin margins of profit and the terrible devastation wrought by the climate crisis that they themselves are participating in, that it just becomes this insane, everything's just being tied into knots here. But I think it is also worth noting in America that their meat that is not lab grown, as in just the normal animal meat, is awash with chemicals. I mean, it is riddled with chemicals. There's also a reason that the idea of chlorine-washed chicken became such a political hot potato in our post-Brexit trade deal negotiations with the US, that people in the UK didn't want this gross chlorine-washed chicken from the US coming into the UK. They thought it was lower standards. You know, I mean, they mentioned Chick-fil-A in that video. I have eaten at Chick-fil-A. I am telling you, there is not one bit of real animal in that chicken. So, yeah, I do think it's about much more than just meat.
I think for legal reasons, we should point out that there may be one bit of chicken-related material in Chick-fil-A, but possibly
it's very delicious, though. It is very delicious, I will say that.
You were the only person in there with your Ted Baker coat on.
Yeah. Don't insult her.
I wish I could afford a Ted Baker coat.
You don't, Harriet. Trust me. You
no,
don't.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
Please don't.
On which, I say thank you to Holden, Harriet and Leaf. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And we're off to Chick-fil-A until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.